Hello and welcome back to my channel The Bleach Fanfiction. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the first part of What If Ichigo was transformed into two entities. So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. Chapter 1, Failure. Ichigo's breath came in ragged breaths. He knew he was dying. He'd failed. The hole in chest was a testament to that. He had known that this was a possibility, but hadn't truly thought about it. His mind was shutting down too, as his sight had darkened slightly. Everything around him was as black as the night was in Hueco Mundo. As he gasped for breath, his lungs gave a shake before blood was expelled from them, or he should say from his remaining lung, as the hole in his chest was a through and through and there was no lung there any longer. Memories began to flicker in his mind as his remaining hand clutched Zangetsu's hilt, his sword broken once more. He could barely see the two spirits that had always been with him. They were flickering, like ghosts, in his mind's eye. He still could remember seeing Zero Squad dead in the royal realm. The monk that had helped train him and Rukia, cut into pieces by Yhwach. Hearing his voice telling Ichigo to call his name, Hyusobichibai, and suddenly he came back to life. Him asking Ichigo to defeat Yhwach and protect Soul King, but at the same time saying that because they were humans they couldn't defeat Yhwach. He could still see Yhwach when he arrived in the Soul Palace and say, "You are to be crushed atop the gears of fate. A small insect like you has no need to curse his destiny. Be thankful that it shall be by these very hands that you perish." How true those words turned out to be. He thought as a single tear escaped his eyes. More blood dribbled out of his lips as his breath became even more ragged. "I'm drowning in my own blood," he thought grimly as his eyes became even more blurred. What he hadn't known at the time, was that Kisuke's plans were almost complete as he, Chad, Inoue and Yoruchi had gone to save the Soul King. Hiyori and the rest of the Visors had appeared in the research and development building, shocking Shinji, who's standing next to Soifan waiting for Kisuke to finish telling them what to do to get to the Soul Palace. Hiyori yells at Shinji for dumping his workload on them while he was off helping save Soul Society with Urahara's help. Hiyori sprays the area with a fume that looks like a liquid. It's a substance created between the distortion points between Soul Society and the Dangai. He had no idea how much they truly were helping Soul Society and the Godai 13. They had regained their Shihakusho from Urahara, though Hiyori had fussed only to have Love stop her by slinging her over his shoulder and walking away with her and the others. Urahara had created a gateway between Soul Society and the Royal Realm with the help from the captains of the Godai 13. Yhwach had said many things, such as being able to see all. At the time Ichigo hadn't understood, not like he did now. He even asked, "You've seen all? What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Like the cocky teen he was. "I saw everything. Yhwach had said, that you would in fact come here and that the you who came here." He moves aside. "Would be too late to change anything." Ichigo gasps in surprise when he saw Yhwach's sword piercing the Soul King's body. "The Soul King is dead. There is no longer anything you can do to remedy this." Yhwach had said so proudly, and being so stupid he had run to grab the sword to pull it out, but just then his Quincy blood began to activate, forced him to kill the Soul King. Ichigo shivered as his body began to feel cold. "I killed the king. How could I allow this to happen? The king is dead because of me. I should have been stronger. No, smarter, maybe. It was a trap. He egged me on and I took the bait." His thoughts began to feel clearer, even as his body began to shut down. Only moments ago he and Renji were fighting Yhwach in Soul Society alongside Aizen, who had used his sword Kyuka Suigestu on Yhwach. Never in a million years had he thought he'd fight alongside that traitor, but it had happened. But it failed. He thought grimly as he closed his eyes, his breath coming out in slower, softer puffs. Killing Aizen and then cutting Renji's sword hand off, Yhwach came after Ichigo, who dodged the attacks the best he could. Yhwach had smiled. "You've got some annoying, persistent good fortune, Ichigo." He said this before snarling in anger at the boy. Zangetsu had merged into one sword from being two. Ichigo had thought he had the edge. His sword was stronger, so was he. He no longer doubted himself or the spirits within him. With double-bladed weapon in his hand, he prepared for the next attack. The Ryatsu around them had tripled, causing the ground to break up. Ichigo was already so tired, but he knew everyone was depending on him to stop this monster. If only I had been stronger, he thought mournfully. Yhwach had seen his exhaustion and chuckled because of it, and Ichigo felt his stomach drop at his next words. "You're hanging on by a thread, Ichigo. I used that form too soon." He thought, dimly aware that something or someone was watching him. Cracking his eye open, he saw nothing but shadows. Ichigo had prepared for the final attack, but Yhwach moved too quickly, faster than any flash step Ichigo had ever seen, and as his arm is torn from his body, Ichigo hears Yhwach's voice again. "Nothing escapes my gaze," he says as his hand reaches for Ichigo. The young man gasps as his sword shatters before his very eyes. "Rest in pieces, Ichigo." He suddenly felt his chest exploding in pain as a hole the size of a fist appears in his chest. "It's been fun, Ichigo." Yhwach's voice wavered as his ears rung from the pain he was experiencing. He barely caught the next few words. "Resistance was amusing best." Ichigo had suddenly felt his body hit the ground as he was cast away from Yhwach, gasping for air, blood splurting out of his mouth as he coughed up blood. His lungs, one of which was gone, filled with the red liquid. "Karen, Yuzu. Forgive me," he had thought as he had lain there dying. In the distance he heard Renji's voice screaming his name. From the corner of his eye he had seen hand appear out of thin air and pull him into a hole of darkness where he began to lose consciousness. However, now that he was there, he found himself feeling oddly at peace, as the final moments of his life was spent regretting that he had failed his friends and family. Just then a soft and gentle voice fills his mind. "My warrior, you have not failed. I should have made two, instead of one." Ichigo could feel his very soul shaking at the voice. Turning his head to the side where the voice had been, he saw nothing but a shadow. Who are you?" he gasped as his throat filled with blood once more. Coughing the blood up, it sprayed everywhere. "It doesn't matter. But now no, I will make this right," the shadow said as it lifted a hand, and Ichigo began to feel tired, even more so than he had been. Silence filled Ichigo's mind, and slowly his consciousness comes to an end. "I know how to fix this, I've just got to do it quickly," the shadow stated as it began to fade. "To you it'll be years before we meet again, but to me, it'll be seconds." The shadow became a wisp as the power that bound it to this plane of existence began to fade away. A bright yellow light shot out from the wisp as it quickly faded and entered the dying young man's body. Outside the plane of existence everything froze in place before, like a machine, it went backwards and everything began to rewind until it came to a certain point in time. Inside the separate plane Ichigo's body shrunk until it was that of a babe's, and then it glowed as he turned into a ball of energy and vanished first into one ball of energy until it suddenly split in half, a glow surrounding both as if it was trying to protect the two halves of its host until it vanished inside of the two orbs. In the real world the hands of time stopped for only a moment as it was turned backwards before it begun once more. A Shinigami male with dark hair and a Quincy woman with reddish-brown hair stared at each other before they began laughing lightly as the hands of destiny began to pull the two souls together once more. "Ishin," a feminine voice cried out in the small medical clinic in the town of Kurakura Town. The young woman who yelled was leaning against the kitchen counter, her usually tied-back hair was cascading around her face in long waves of orangish-brown, her bangs shadowed her brown eyes, concealing them. Panting lightly she grasped her very large pregnant stomach as pain radiated across her womb. "It's time," she thought as she felt a surge of joy radiate through her entire being. They'd finally get to meet their child. She truly hoped it was a little boy, she wanted a son so badly. though Ishin had his heart set on a daughter. They hadn't looked on their last several sonogram pictures, she had made sure Ishin wouldn't cheat. The little one was a week overdue, but that hadn't worried her, it just meant she could protect it a little longer with her body. She lifted her head at the sound of a crash. Her dearly beloved husband had crashed into the new table she'd moved, again, when he had tripped over his own 2 feet. Covering her mouth she began to laugh lightly. Oh, how she loved this man. He had sacrificed everything for her. After being injured by a hollow, she'd begun to hollowify only for him to save her by binding his soul to hers. She hadn't married him straight away, instead she made him go to the Tokyo University and get an education in order for him to care for her and any children they had. He had been reluctant. However, it wasn't like he could return to where he'd come from, at least not until she passed on in life. Her husband had been a Shinigami and she was a Quincy. Their people were supposed enemies, but she couldn't help herself when she'd fallen in love with him. Ishin fell to the floor with a groan before looking at the offending object he had run into. Did you move that again? He asked her before rushing over to her when he saw that she was in pain. He went over to the phone that was on the wall and dialed a number. After a few rings a voice came through the receiver. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded condescending. Ryukin. Ishin spoke into the phone, gaining a groan from the male on the other end. Shiba, how many times have I said to lose this number? The man growled in annoyance. Masaki has gone into labor, he said with a smile on his face. I thought as her cousin you should know. A sigh was heard on the other end of the receiver. I'll be at the hospital, was the male's reply before he hung up. Ishin. Masaki's voice gained her husband's attention. Let's go, she said as she headed towards the door. Ishin smiled happily. Yes, my beloved Masaki, he yelled as he chased after her, grabbing a bag on his way out. Ishin paced back and forth in the waiting room. His wonderful, beautiful wife had kicked him out of the room because he was making her nervous. It wasn't fair. The second most joyful day of his life and he couldn't watch because his wife told him to get out. Of course he had pouted like a child at being thrown out of the room by one of the nurses, but at least he wasn't alone. His eyes turned towards Ryukin Ishida, the man was currently reading a book, with his pregnant wife Kane Katgiri next to him. Neither looked nervous or upset that he was there, but Ishin was. This was his first child and he'd been denied access. Sit down. Ryukin mumbled as he turned the page to his book he was reading. Lifting his head up he looked at the former Shinigami, his glasses gleaming in the fluorescent lighting. Sit down, he emphasized. Ishin couldn't understand the young man's hostility lately. True, their people were enemies, but he'd never hurt either Ryukin or his Masaki. Lately Ryukin reminded him of the stuffy old elders of the Shiba clan back in Soul Society. He slowly sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs, his knee bouncing with his nerves. He heard Kane giggle before shushing her husband as he went to once again say something. Suddenly the door opened and an older doctor came out. Ishin liked this man, mainly because he reminded him of his old advisor and friend, Jushiro Yukitake. The man's silvery white hair was tied back as he walked up to Ishin. Mr. Kurosaki, he greeted Ishin. Masaki did just fine. She is resting and waiting to show you what she's had, he chuckled as he was careful of his words. She wants it to be a surprise. Can they come? He nodded towards Ryukin and his wife, Ryukin pushing his glasses up his nose as he stood. Are they family? The doctor asked, gaining a nod. Then of course, he replied with a bright smile. Being led down the halls of the maternity ward, they were led past the room with the babies in it. Ishin felt so nervous as he was brought to the door of Masaki's room. The doctor chuckled as Ishin opened the door and stood stock still at what he saw in the room. Laying in Masaki's arms was a baby swaddled in a blue blanket and in the hospital bassinet next to her was a second baby wrapped in a pink blanket. What? He cried out in surprise, too. He yelled before rushing over to his wife who giggled at his words. Ishin kissed her cheek. What a surprise, he said a bit quieter. He pushed the blanket off his son's head and paused before laughing. He's got orange hair, he laughed loudly, causing the amber-brown eyes of the little boy to open for a moment. Ishin swore the boy was glaring at him. Ryukin watched his wife push the blanket back from the little girl's head. Bright orange hair was met by a similar giggle from the other woman. Seems you have a matching set, he responded before looking at Masaki. Congratulations, he said with a nod of his head towards her. Thank you, Ryukin, she said tiredly. Later that night in the halls of Kurakura Hospital in the maternity ward where the babies were kept, the newly born Kurosaki twins slept peacefully before an unseen dark aura settled around them. Their eyes opened simultaneously, black eyes with golden pupils stared at the world around it, before the eyes returned to the normal color. Outside the hospital, a tall lean-built man with light skin and gray eyes stood outside the Kurakura Hospital, having felt a familiar Ryatsu. His dark green Haori coat blew in the light breeze, his eyes were hidden in the shadows under his stripped dark green and white bucket hat. His feet made a clink sound as he walked with his Geta sandals. He slid through the hospital doors silently, the night nurse none even looking up, as she wasn't spiritually aware. He was in a spirit form as he walked through the halls of the hospital in search for the hollow-like Ryatsu he had felt. It almost felt like. He paused as he felt something nearing him. A woman with dark purple hair and wearing a bright orange jacket appearing before him. Yoruchi, he said her name with respect. Kisuk, she replied softly, a half-smirk on her face. You felt it too, she asked as watched him pull out his fan. I don't know what you're talking about, he feinted as he moved past her. She chuckled. Sure. She said as she followed him through the hospital until they came to the maternity ward. There's a hollow nearby, she said, gaining a hum of affirmation from him. She looked at the babies as they passed by them before Kisuk turned towards them. He pulled a device out of his coat pocket and began to scan the children until he paused over two. My. He said as his voice turned to one with curiosity in it. It would seem these two were born with a hollow in them. How? Yoruchi inquired as worry began to work its way into her system. Unknown. But they seem to dormant right now, he scratched his chin. They have a huge amount of Ryoryoku. Removing his hand from his chin, he watched as first the boy looked directly at him before the girl did the same. They see us, he realized. Newly born souls usually can't they, she asked him. Or is it the hollow in them? He looked at the children before turning his attention to their family name. His eyes widening as he recognized the family name. Ishin, he said softly, causing Yoruchi to look at him with a raised eyebrow. Shiba, she inquired as she looked at Kisuk, who was now smiling. Kisuk? I believe the future is about to get interesting, Yoruchi, he looked at her. If you wouldn't mind, could you watch these two? Try to ensure neither of their parents know who you are. Sure, but you owe me, she said with a smirk. I'll have Tessai make your favorite meals when you visit, he said, knowing her weakness. Oh, she chuckled before vanishing into a plume of smoke. A small black cat sat in her place. This should be interesting, the cat said as it took off to find a good hiding place. Kisuk kept looking at the orange-haired newborns and smiled. Indeed, it should be, my old friend. As he walked away from the children's hospital itself, he looked around to see if he could sense any Shinigami nearby before he tipped his hat back, his blonde hair being messed by the light wind on the late summer night. I think it's time to check in with some old friends and tell them what I've discovered. He thought as he wondered how these particular people will react to his discovery. Ichigo. Brown eyes opened instantly as the owner of those eyes woke up suddenly. A crash was heard as the young boy of 6 fell from his bed. His father's voice the reason he'd been forced to awaken. Above him he heard the bunk squeak and saw his face mirrored by his twin, who is trying to suppress a giggle. The two had been sharing a room ever since they'd been born. Strange as that seemed, what was even more so was the fact that if they did sleep in separate rooms they usually would find their way back to each other. The bunk beds had been their father's idea. The same father who always acted like an idiot and would do the strangest things, like rude awakenings on the weekends. "He does know it's Saturday, right?" she asked him, gaining a scowl from her brother. Her answer came a second later as the door burst open and a black-haired middle-aged man came into the room yelling, "My babies!" Both children glared at their father. "Rise and shine," he laughed as he went to pull them into his arms. "Ishin," came their mother's returning yell. The twins watched their father freeze and slowly turn around, both smiling twin smiles at the turn of events. In the doorway was Masaki with Yuzu on her hip and Karen on her other hip. The two-year-olds having been awakened by their obnoxious father's rather loud voice. Masaki was like a mother bear when it came to her children and he had disturbed their beauty sleep. "Masaki, my sweet dash," he began when he froze at the glare in her eyes. Oh. He thought and knew he was in for it. "Why are you yelling at 7 a.m. in the morning, on a Saturday?" she demanded as she was barely holding back her anger at being awakened so rudely by her husband's voice. "Saturday?" he questioned, gaining sweat drops from his eldest children. Thinking quickly he answered. "Saturday morning cartoons." "Daddy time," he said excitedly. Masaki's eyebrow twitched. "You woke the children for mindless cartoons?" she asked, sounding annoyed as she put the two younger children down, who ran over to Ichigo, who was now watching this little drama like it was the best entertainment going on. He helped both girls into his bed and watched what would unfold next. Ishin laughed nervously. "Now, Masaki," he began, only to have his wife walk up to him and snag his left ear and tug it hard until he was crying out. "Masaki," he cried as he was pulled from the room. All four children following to watch their tall father be punished by their short mother. Smiles on all four children's faces, especially the two older ones who were used to this kind of thing. "Dad never learns," Ichigo stated with a grumble before looking at his twin who held Yuzu in her arms. The little one looking tired still. "You still want to sleep, Verena?" The older girl sighed as she looked towards him. "You know he'll just sneak us down later," she said tiredly. He gave a nod before picking up Karen. The dark-haired child wrapped her arms around his neck as he took her downstairs. Clutched in her hands was her baby blanket, as Yuzu sucked on her pacifier. Both of the older twins sat their siblings onto the couch before turning on the TV and searching for the cartoons. Once the station was found, they went into the kitchen that was next to the living room and began searching for their cereal. Once 4 bowls were filled, they went back over to the couch and sat the bowls on the table. Yuzu and Karen climbed down onto the floor and began to eat their breakfast with their older siblings. A couple hours later Verena looked towards the stairs to see their mom walking down them looking quite happy. "Who's hungry?" she asked, causing the children to look at their empty bowls on the table. "I am," came their father's voice from the upstairs. "We ate," Verena stated as they continued to watch the TV. "Really?" Masaki took in the mess in the kitchen and the bowls on the table. "I see." She walked over to the couch and kissed Ichigo and Verena's foreheads. "What helpful children I have," the praise caused both children to smile. "Why don't you both go get dressed and afterwards we will go to the park?" "Okay," was their dual answer as they ran up the stairs to go get dressed. They almost caused Ishin to fall as they ran through his legs. "Whoa," he cried out. "Where's the fire?" he asked as the two disappeared upstairs. Masaki laughed at her husband as he came around her and kissed her neck as he wrapped his arms around her waist. "Help me with Yuzu and Karen and we'll go to the park to have family time," she asked him, causing him to smile. "Of course, my beloved," he kissed her cheek before rushing over to the twin girls. "Who wants to get dressed?" he asked them, only to have Karen grab his nose and pull hard. "Ouch," he cried out and began to rub the offended appendage. "Silly daddy," she said before sliding off of the couch and running off as Yuzu began laughing as she chased her sister. "That hurt," he mumbled, causing Masaki to chuckle before she scooped Karen up into her arms. Isshin grabbed the second child and began to make their way up the stairs. Once in the park, Verena and Ichigo ran off to hide from their father, who was chasing the other two. Verena noticed Ichigo was staring off into the distance, a frown marring his face. "What is it, Ichi?" she asked him as she looked off to where he was looking. "Do you see it?" he asked as he continued to look off into the distance. She asked as she looked into the distance but saw nothing but trees there. "There's a woman crying there. She's see-through though," he stated. "A ghost?" she asked him with wide eyes. He gave a nod. "I've seen them before, but never this clearly," he said. "I told Dad, but he says he can't see them." He looked away from the woman and up into the sky. "I've been having weird dreams again." He looked at her. "Of you dying?" she asked. He nodded as he shuffled his feet in the dirt. "Have you told Daddy or Mommy?" He shook his head. "No," he stated as he shoved his hands into his pockets. "I had dreams of a person who looks just like me but has white skin and hair, but has black and golden eyes too." He looked at his sister. "He's in this world with buildings facing sideways. He talks, but I can't hear him. It's like his voice is on mute or something. Maybe you need to listen more carefully," she stated. "Next time he appears, you should listen really, really carefully to him. Maybe he's like your invisible friend or something." She laughed at his confused look. "Why would I need an invisible friend?" he asked her, only to get a shrug as she took off in a run. Deciding to chase her, he took off after her and left behind him the gloomy thoughts as he tried to have fun with his family. It was a couple days later when Ichigo and Verena were at school when a new kid was introduced to the children. He was tall and lanky looking. He called himself Lee, and almost instantly Ichigo didn't like him, and as the kid came out onto playground later that day, Ichigo found that the feeling was mutual. Lee, it turned out, was a bully. He pushed Ichigo around on the playground, calling him names like freak, berry boy, strawberry and flower. He also pushed, punched and kicked Ichigo, and nobody seemed to care as he was being beat up. He was suddenly pushed against the fence between the first years and the ninth year classes and was about to get punched in the face when suddenly a hand grabbed Lee's and pushed it away. Ichigo opened his eyes to find his sister's angry-looking face as she suddenly kicked Lee between his legs. Ichigo winced as he saw the boy go down clutching his privates. "Leave my brother alone, you big bully," she yelled as she kicked the downed boy in the gut. Grabbing her brother's hand, she pulled Ichigo with her to find a teacher and show them Ichigo's bloodied nose. After that incident, everybody knew not to pick on Ichigo. It was also after that moment that Ichigo decided he'd get stronger. He didn't want to see his sister get hurt because of him. She wasn't just his sister, she was his protector, but the same could be said of him. He wasn't just her brother, he was her protector too. In the end though, it was Isshin and Masaki who decided it was time they both learned how to defend themselves. They began to go to the dojo that was nearby. It was there that they met Tatsuki Arisawa, a young girl who was also taking martial arts and was really good at it, so much so that the two began to learn from her. Instantly the twins liked the girl, and almost as fast the three became friends. It was here that the hands of time began to once again change. 3 years had passed since Ichigo and Verena had begun going to the dojo. Both passing every obstacle that came at them. Their best friend Tatsuki had passed her tests faster than they had because, as it turned out, her family owned the dojo and therefore she got more practice than they did. Their father, however, did give them someone to beat up on though. The older man never learned not to provoke either of them, and as they got older the two began to teach Yuzu and Karen how to defend themselves, which pleased their mother greatly, though it sent their father into tears very often. Ichigo was better at hand-to-hand combat while Verena was best at using her feet to keep her enemies at bay. She was faster than Ichigo, while he was stronger than she was. However, both children had a slight habit of crying when hurt, like every child their age. They were both determined to get rid of such a weakness, even if they did like the attention from their mother when she would see those tears. Neither used their newfound strength at school, they thought it would give them an unfair advantage. That didn't mean there weren't times that they would react on instinct to protect themselves or those around them from bullies, especially the bullies. In fact, bullies learned early on never to mess with them if the two Kurosaki children were near one another. Separate, the bullies thought they would be weaker, but that's when their inner strengths would come forward, giving them time for the other to appear. Currently Ichigo was looking at a spirit child that was crying. Looking around himself he noticed that nobody was paying attention to him. The park was busy, as it always was after school. The trees swayed gently in the breeze and the birds chirping kept most children's attention off of him. His father was busy with his younger siblings, so he went to see if he could help make the spirit child happy. He found years ago that he could see spirits, and the older he got the bigger the spirits he could see and hear. Verena didn't always see them. Standing in front of the little spirit girl, he spoke gently to her. "Hey," he greeted her, causing her to look up at her. "Why are you crying?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She wasn't the first spirit he had spoken to, nor would she be the last. "I'm Ichigo Kurosaki," he held out his hand to her. "You need help to stand?" You can see me?" she asked as she sniffed her nose. "Yeah," he said with a smile. "I've always seen spirits." The little girl took his outstretched hand. I am Nia," she sniffed as she wiped away her tears. "I'm lost." "Where do you live?" he asked, looking around for his father who was now looking his way. "My dad can take us there," he said, pointing at him. The little girl gave a nod. "I live by the river." "Ichigo." Hearing his name spoken he turned around towards Ishin. "Goat face," he said with a teasing smile. "There's a little girl spirit that I want to help." Ishin sighed as he looked at his son. Just beyond his son was the child spirit in question who was looking at him with hope in her eyes. For years his boy had spoken about seeing spirits. Masaki and him both told Ichigo that they couldn't see them, but the truth was they could, just not like they used to do to what had to be done in order to save Masaki's life many years ago. "Where to?" he asked his son, a gentle smile appearing on his face. Just because he couldn't see the child very well couldn't help it. Ichigo gave a blinding smile. "Thanks Pops," he turned to Nia. "Let's go," he grabbed her hand, causing the spirit child to laugh happily. They stood in front of a big yellow gated house that stood in front of the river with the big bridge that went into Kurakura town. The house was burned in one window and had crime scene tape around the entrance of the house. Ichigo looked at his father. "What happened here, goat face?" Karen looked down at her papa as he had her on his shoulders. She was curious for the answer as well. Yuzu and Verena looked at him from their place next to Ichigo. Ishin scratched his face as he tried to figure out how to explain that there had been a fire where the child more than likely died in. "Well, you see," he began, only for the child to explain. "I remember now," Nia said as her memory became clearer. "I was sleeping in my baby brother's room because he was always crying, but when I slept in there he stayed quiet," her mind filled with images from the memory. "I fell asleep but was woken up by a weird smell. I tried to leave the room but the door wouldn't open. I then opened the window and began coughing. I went back and grabbed my brother and wrapped him in his blanket. I dropped him out of the second bedroom window onto the bushes below. Then something fell on top of me and then," she paused and looked at Ichigo. "Then I woke up in the park." Ichigo relayed what she'd said to his father. "It sounds like a frightening experience," his father stated. Just then Nia ran off yelling. "Mommy!" The child ran up to a thin brunette woman with a chain in her chest. "Nia!" the woman cried out as she held her daughter close to her chest. Both began to cry. She looked at Ichigo. "Thank you, Dad," he looked up at his father. "Her mom is here." He watched the two turn translucent before vanishing. "They're gone." Ishin had never seen a spirit cross over on its own. His eyes were wide at what Ichigo had done, before he looked down at his son, pride swelling in his chest. Verena began, her own eyes were wide. I saw them, she looked at Ichigo. I saw them before they disappeared, she yelled excitedly. Ichigo smiled brightly at his sister's admission. It's cool, isn't it? He asked as they began to walk down the street near the river. Aha, she said, nodding before noticing Yuzu's pout. What's wrong, Yuzu? The little girl looked at her older sister. I wanna see the spirits too, she cried out in dismay. Everyone began to laugh. Yuzu, her twin, called out from on top of Ishin's shoulders. I can't see them and neither can Mom or Dad. But they can, she yelled as she pointed at their older siblings. Within time perhaps you'll be able to too, like Verena. Ichigo said softly. Until then, leave the spirit stuff to us. Verena suddenly paused as she felt a shiver run up her spine and looked towards the river. A feeling of dread filling her as a soft voice whispered in her mind to stay away from the river. Ichigo looked back towards her. Sis, he inquired, causing her to look back towards him. Coming, she yelled as she ran towards him. It was a few weeks later after Verena and Ichigo's birthday. They were standing around waiting at the dojo for both of their parents. They always came together whenever it rained when they had to come pick up them. Both began to horse around with each other, Verena wrapping an arm around Ichigo's neck and trying to make him fall while Ichigo wrapped both arms around his sister and squeezed. Tatsuki turned towards the noise and began to watch them in case they got too rough with each other. She was slightly jealous that the two had each other and she had no younger siblings, but being their friend had its perks as suddenly she snuck up behind them and took them both down. She stood over them and laughed before she noticed tears on Ichigo's face. Ichigo. Verena, came Masaki's voice, causing the tears to dry up instantly before both children ran over to their mother. Ishin smiled as he picked Verena up into his arms. How was practice? He asked as put the umbrella up over their heads. Masaki doing the same thing as her husband as Ichigo walked between his parents, smiling happily up at both of them. Fun! Verena yelled happily. I beat Verena. Ichigo announced as he kept pace with his parents on the sidewalk. Really? Ishin asked before looking at his beloved daughter. Do you need more practice on your old man? He asked her, causing Verena to giggle. No, she said with a bright smile. I don't want to hurt you, Daddy. Laughter from Masaki caused Ishin to frown. I'm not that old yet, he complained, causing all three to laugh at him as they walked by the river. Ichigo suddenly caught sight of a girl about to jump into the raging river and let go of his mom's hand to rush off to stop her. Time seemed to stand still for a moment before a voice in Ichigo's mind yelled. Stop! Ichigo stumbled before he fell onto his stomach. At that same moment he heard both of his parents' voices and then a shimmer appeared in front of him. He felt pressure and heat. Masaki, came a cry from his father. Daddy, another scream, this one from Verena. Finally the creature appeared in front of him. A mask on its face, a hook that held the young girl from before. A loud cry sounded from the creature. He felt arms wrap around him and his mother's perfume scent filled his senses. He felt a heated wetness touch his face, his eyes widening as he heard his mother give a pained sound before she pulled him tightly against her body. The creature snarled before the hook turned into a spear, the girl vanishing. His father's form appearing different than it had. He now was wearing black hakama with a black and white robe. A long sword in his father's hands with a blue tassel and red handle with hexagonal tsuba and a white cloth wrapped over his arm and shoulder. As his father cried out as he charged the creature, his mother's body began to feel heavy. Ichigo, he heard her say softly. He turned his attention towards her and looked at his mother. Run! Mom, he saw blood dripping down her forehead, but her hand was glowing blue with odd runes on it. Her eyes met him as a steely look appeared in them. Ichigo, she yelled at him, grabbing his shoulders. Run! Startled Ichigo turned towards his twin, who was shaking their father's body trying to get him to respond, and grabbed her hand and ran as fast as he could just as his father's voice rang throughout the area. Burn and Jetsu. Isshin could feel his heart clench as he heard Masaki's voice scream for Ichigo. Instantly he turned his head in time to see his beautiful and wonderful wife fall to the ground. The strange binding Kido that tied his soul to hers suddenly snapped. Fear hit Isshin so quickly that no other emotion was present. The fog that kept him from seeing high-powered hollows, but allowed him to see low-powered plus spirits, lifted. He jumped out of the jigai that he'd used for over a decade without thought. In front of his eyes laid Masaki in her spirit form, her chain of fate unbroken at the moment, but it was the monstrous hollow that had his attention. Of all the hollows to attack, he thought grimly, it just had to be Grand Fisher. Raising his Zanpakuto, hearing the sword's voice for the first time in many years. It's good to hear you again, old friend. He mentally whispered to the spirit. A beautiful woman with ruby red eyes and waist-length white hair appeared in his mind with blue flames surrounding her. Her gaze met his for a solid moment before he drew his sword from its sheath and he yelled, "Burn and Jetsu," at the top of his lungs. The large hollow lifted his visage from the spirit form that was the woman who had caused him to miss that brat. Yes, women were his favorites to attack and kill. Their souls tasted good to him and allowed him to get others, but that boy's spirit pressure had been so high and it smelt good. Shinigami, he snarled before laughing at the enraged man. So this man had been with the woman, as he could see the downed false body nearby. Her soul belongs to me, he screeched as he took a swipe at the Shinigami with his lure. Not this one. Isshin set his sword in front of him, ready for the attack, and successfully blocked it. You are nothing, I cannot even sense your power, the hollow stated dismissively. Raising the hook lure on its head, it went to strike Masaki's body once more, and this time take her soul and add it to its collection. Suddenly the hook was cut from his head in a single strike, disappearing from sight. Blood sprayed every which way from the new wound. Screaming from more anger than pain, Grand Fisher rushed towards the Shinigami with fury written across his face. Bringing in Jetsu up in defense, Isshin was unprepared to see the large hollow move so quickly. I'm out of practice. He thought, feeling a fear that was beginning to eat away at his stomach. As the hollow grabbed his sword with its teeth, Isshin could hear Anjetsu scream in pain as large cracks began to form on the blade. Getsuga. Isshin began as a claw came at him at the side. Tensho. A huge raise in Isshin's Ryatsu caused Grand Fisher's eyes to widen as suddenly a black arch slash shot out of the blade, a blade that he still had his teeth on. Ripping his mouth from the blade, he barely moved away in time as the attack took off one of his legs. The appendage he had been about to use to gut the Shinigami had been cut from his body and purified. The stump dripped blood from the wound. I have been around for hundreds of years, the hollow began. And you think that you will kill me, he yelled. I'll devour you, then that woman, and finally those brats that the bitch made me miss. His eyes flashed with anger, his Ryatsu swelling and growing larger with his anger. Master. And Jetsu's voice whispered into his mind. We don't have time to dawdle. We must strike with our strongest attack. It had been years since he'd used his Bankai, but Isshin knew that he was being given no choice. You're right. He thought as he began to feel the intense pressure being released by this creature. If he keeps going, then the weak souls nearby will begin to fade. Call it. She said with a smile that would send chills down most enemies' spines, but it only made Isshin smile his own smile that was equally scary looking. Shirohi and Jetsu, he cried out. White flames surrounded Isshin's hand as his blade thinned out like a samurai sword. Flames engraved upon the blade began to light up before flames surrounded the sword also ate away the top of his uniform. Large stations upon his shoulders lit up a blue and silver color. When Isshin lifted his eyes, they were bloody red like those of the spirit inside his sword. Drawing his Ryatsu into his sword, a flash of power exploded around Isshin as his spiritual powers were fully released. Shiro hai o haku ishi. White-hot flames shot out of the sword as it was swung at Grand Fisher. The hollow screamed its fury as it was destroyed and purified by the white flames that seemed to burn the very air itself. Isshin suddenly felt weakened from releasing his Zanpakuto for the first time in over a decade, thus he fell to his knees. Masaki. He thought as he crawled over to her fallen form. Pulling her into his arms, he could see a hole appearing on her chest. He did not know what to do. His beautiful, wonderful wife was dying. Slowly her body was turning into that of a hollow. He heard the sudden use of a flash step and looked up in time to see the only man that might be able to help her. Urahara Kisuke. He spoke the man's name as if it was a taboo to be spoken. What happened? Urahara inquired as he quickly approached the two. His eyes quickly going to the slowly forming hole. He could also feel her spirit cores were beginning to shut down at the same time. If he didn't act quickly to help her, she would die and soon. Grand Fisher was all Isshin said at first. Frowning, Urahara knew what was going to happen. Another victim to the hollow. He thought sadly, his mind calculating on what could be done to stop her death, but he was coming up with a blank. They couldn't bind Isshin's soul with hers again, not with her soul beginning to evaporate. I killed it. Isshin said, tears beginning to fall. Please. She can't die, he pleaded with the former Squad 12 captain and creator of research and development. Kisuke's eyes met those of Isshin's. He gave a deep sigh. I cannot dash. If you need something, take it from me. Isshin yelled. If she dies, I cannot live. Kisuke's eyes widened at Isshin's shout. There may be a way, but you will die, he explained. I don't care, was Isshin's answer. Our children cannot live without their mother and I will die without her, he explained, trying to get his message across to the man in front of himself. She can go on. She will survive this. I will not. Isshin. Kisuke said his name softly. Knowing he had very little choice, Kisuke gave a nod. Okay, but this will hurt. What I'm about to do is dismantle part of your spirit and soul, which in turn will enter her, balance her spirit and soul and bring them back to a normal process. His eyes looked sadly at Isshin. You will be awake for all of this. As soon as she awakens, when I place her back into her body, you will begin to fade, and finally, he took a deep breath before finishing. You will die. Without thought of his own fate, Isshin gave a nod. Do it. Kisuke nodded as he watched Isshin place Masaki down. Forcing the other to lay down next to her, Kisuke placed one head over Masaki's core where her soul was to be balanced, then placed his other hand on Isshin's body and began to whisper words that were supposed to be forbidden. This technique had been developed, not by himself, but by another, and because of the dangerous implications it carried, it had been forbidden to be used by Center 46 many years ago. Isshin's screams of pain could be heard as a part of his soul and spirit was being ripped from his body, turned into energy and placed back into Masaki's body to heal the damage done by Grand Fisher and White many years ago. Isshin trembled on the other side of Kisuke as he tried to breathe while Kisuke picked Masaki's soul form up off of the ground and back into her body. Put me back. Isshin gasped as he nodded towards the Jigai. It won't allow you to live much longer than a few moments. Kisuke warned him. It'll be enough, he gasped, his spirit becoming translucent for a moment before returning to solid form. Kisuke did as he was asked. It was the least he could do for the dying man. He helped Isshin back into the false body before standing. Please. Isshin gasped. Find my children. Kisuke sighed sadly, but he could not say no to this small request. I will. Rest assured, I will find them, he said before turning away and stepping away from the two. His heart feeling heavy at the feeling of losing a good friend and ally. Ichigo had never been as scared as he was in that moment. His heart pounded in his chest and he swore he could feel his heart in his throat too. He refused to release his twin's hand as he ran, even as she screamed at it to let her go. Mom had told him to run so fervently that he had known that he had to listen to her. He loved his mom, and seeing her hurt so badly had made him ache inside, but he was so small and the monster had been so big. He suddenly tripped on his feet as his shoes became untied, and as he went down so did Verena. He felt a sudden pressure seize through the air and heard his sister gasp as she suddenly couldn't breathe. Grabbing her, he pulled her into an alley and hid behind a dumpster. Covering her body with his, Ichigo prayed that somebody would come to help them. It was then Ichigo felt something drip on him that wasn't rain, but was wet and sticky. Looking up, he saw a different monster cackle high above them, thinking they were easy prey. As its mouth came down to grab them with its sharp teeth, Ichigo felt something snap inside him. Suddenly he felt as if he was falling backwards into a sea of darkness, and as he fell he saw a white-haired being with gold/black eyes rise up past him. "Don't worry, King, I'll take care of it," he said, causing Ichigo to wonder, who was that was about to help them. Black seeped into Ichigo's eyes as gold took over his pupils. A hiss escaped his lips as he lifted his visage up at the monster trying to kill him. Raising his hand up and pointing a finger at the creature, a ball of red energy formed and blasted upwards towards the sky. As the energy connected with the creature's head, it was obliterated. Verena had looked up at her brother the moment that she had heard the hiss escape his lips. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw her brother create a ball of energy that had suddenly shot forward from his hand and killed a creature she hadn't known had been there moments ago. As his eyes turned back towards her, she was left breathless as those black/gold eyes looked back at her. He placed a finger at his lips, a silent request for her to be silent about what she'd witnessed before his eyes returned to their normal color. When his body slumped forward towards her, Verena caught him and held her brother close to her. Silently she began to cry. Verena did not understand what had happened nor why it had happened, but she did understand one thing, and that was that nothing would be as it was. Sudden noise caused Verena to turn her head sharply towards the entrance of the alley, see a man wearing Geta shoes, a cane and a striped bucket hat. Her eyes were wide with fear as he approached her, his wooden shoes making a clicking sound with each step. Tightening her embrace upon Ichigo as he bent down to her cold and shaking body. He spoke a single word before unconsciousness claimed her. "Sleep." Kisuke watched as the girl slumped forward against her twin's already unconscious form. Looking behind him, Kisuke spotted one of his old companions appear from thin air. "Shinji," he greeted his old friend. "Felt somebody release a Zero nearby," he said with his usual swagger as he approached the once long ago captain. His once long blonde hair was cut to his chin. Noticing the twins, he raised an eyebrow at them. "Likewise," was Kisuke's response as he ran his hand over both children, trying to sense which one had done so with a bit of Kido, but found that whoever had done it was now back in the inner world of one of the children. Sighing, he stood up and looked towards the wizard. "It was one of them, but I cannot tell which one. You better figure it out soon or else we'll have a problem on our hands," Shinji said briskly before looking around himself. "We don't need the Shinigami looking around this town." He pulled his newsboy cap down over his eyes as he turned to leave the alley. A man with cornrows weighted by a truck nodded at him as he did so. When Kisuke poked his head out of the alley, he smiled at his childhood friend. "Tessai," he waved at his friend to come help him with the children. Masaki held Ishin's head on her lap as he laid gasping in pain, a gurgling sound coming from his throat as he tried to breathe. "Saki," he gasped her name. Blood dripped from his mouth as he did so, his body was breaking down from the inside out. She grasped his hand to her face. "I'm here," she said quietly as tears began to fall from her eyes. His eyes slowly opened, allowing him to see the woman he loved. "You find them," he gasped. She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you, Ishin," she said tearfully when suddenly the air filled with powerful spirit pressure. Looking towards the horizon, Masaki witnessed a pillar of red energy shoot into the sky. "Zero," Ishin whispered. "Find them," he spoke once more before his breath left his body forever, his body shimmering before turning into spirit particles and floating off into the night. Masaki covered her face with her hands as she cried when she felt the presence of somebody watching her. Looking up, she saw an older man that she recognized looking at her. Older with slightly graying hair, but still had those gentle and caring eyes. Soken Ishida looked at her with such caring eyes. He moved from the sidewalk and gently placed his hands upon her shoulders. "It is okay to cry, child," he said gently, having seen what happened. "After your time of mourning is over, come find me and I will help you become strong once more." She grasped his hand. "We have children," she stated. "Then I will teach them as I do my own grandson," he stated confidently as he helped her stand even as her tears overtook her once more. When Ichigo woke up, he found himself in a bed that wasn't his own. Next to him Verena laid wide awake as she watched him, her hand clashing his tightly. "Sis?" he questioned her with uncertainty. "You okay, Ichi?" she asked him in a quiet voice. "Okay," that set off alarms in his head. His sister did not do quiet or meekness, and that was definitely what she was doing. "Yeah," he answered with a frown. "Are you?" She nodded as she pulled him closer. "You scared me," she mumbled in his chest. "Sorry," he replied with honesty in his voice. "Mom said to run, so I grabbed you and ran." She nodded against his chest. "Sis, where are we?" "I believe I can answer that question," came an unfamiliar voice. Turning his head, Ichigo frowned as he looked at the strange man in the bucket hat, Geta shoes and oversized clothes. "My name is Urahara Kisuke, though my friends call me Kisuke, acquaintances call me Urahara," Kisuke said as he used a paper fan to cool himself. For some reason neither of those names seemed to fit the man in Ichigo's opinion. "Where are we, Getabushi?" he asked once again. He questioned. "Geta what?" he asked himself, not quite getting the name the boy had used. Ichigo looked at the man with an annoyed look before looking at his sister, who giggled. "Is he fair real?" he asked her, causing her to giggle again. "Of course I am," Kisuke said with a sigh. "As to answer your question, my doubting friend, you are at my home and business." "Business?" Ichigo inquired quizzledly. "I am the proud owner of Urahara's candy shop," he announced happily. "Candy shop?" Ichigo repeated, gaining a nod from the strange man. "Are you a pervert?" Ichigo questioned, causing Kisuke to deflate in defeat. A chuckle gained Ichigo's attention, causing the boy to look towards a cat who suddenly was being glared at by the strange man. "Hush, Yoruchi," he commented towards the cat. Ichigo felt a bad feeling bubbling up as sweat dripped down his neck. The guy is talking to a cat like it understands him. He groaned inwardly. "He's a smart kid," the cat responded back. Ichigo's jaw dropped. "Ichi, the kitty talks," Verena exclaimed. "No shit. I've got ears, Veer," he yelled back, his shock still evident. He turned his attention back to the other two occupants. "Okay, what the heck is going on?" he demanded. "What's the last thing you remember?" Kisuke inquired as he batted the paper fan at his face. "Running," he stated quickly. "Think about it," Kisuke said gently. Ichigo groaned as he flopped back on the futon and closed his eyes. A flash of white blazed before his eyes. He began. "I saw a kid that looked like me," he said, still thinking out loud. "He said something, but I don't remember what it was. I do remember wondering who he was." Kisuke looked at Yoruchi, who gave him a look. "Does that help?" "It does, Ichigo," Kisuke said as he stood up to leave. "Hey, Getabushi." Kisuke turned towards the boy. "How'd you know my name?" Kisuke chuckled. "I'm a friend of your parents, Masaki and Ishin," he answered before closing the sliding door and walked into the store area where he found Masaki waiting. "Are they okay?" she asked. Kisuke knew it was best to tell her the truth, but he didn't want her to be fearful of the boy. "The twins have a lot of Ryatsu within them. I have examined them and I believe Ichigo may become a Shinigami one day soon, especially with how much Ryatsu he has," he sighed when he saw her shoulders sag a bit. They could both become Shinigami, but Verena could also become Quincy. Ichigo has got something there. It's quite possible he may have some hidden Quincy powers. They'll need training, no matter what, came an elderly voice from the doorway. Kisuke looked at the older Quincy, who had showed up out of nowhere, and gave him a nod in agreement. Perhaps Ishida, perhaps, he said ominously. Ichigo glared at the glasses-wearing self-proclaimed true Quincy boy, Yuryu Ishida. He did not like the other boy. His mother stood off to the side with a sad look that he was really starting to hate seeing on her face. He really missed Goatface himself, and since that day he'd been forced to train with the old man, Soken Ishida, who wasn't that bad of a person to train with. Next to the old man was Getabushi, who he and Verena trained with on weekends. He just had a sneaking suspicion that the pervert just liked beating kids up, because he swore that's all anybody had been doing to him lately. Focus King. Outside his own head, Ichigo cringed at the loud noise that weird echoing voice always seemed to make whenever he wasn't paying attention. Next to him Yuryu once again glared at him. Today they were learning how to create their Quincy bows, which seemed dumb to him, but he wanted to see his mom smile at least once today. Focus. He thought to himself only to hear snickering in his head that echoed. Maybe he was going crazy and that's why he heard voices in his head, though lately his dreams were filled with a white-haired boy chasing him around a world with huge skyscrapers on their sides or upside down. It was really weird. Upon hearing his name called, Ichigo stepped forward and stood next to old man Ishida. Listening to the instructions once more, Ichigo took a deep breath and focused on the energy around him. He could barely sense it, but he did feel something around him. Pulling it close and gathering the energy to himself, a bow slowly formed. It was small, but the color was not the bluish-white color that Yuryu's had been, but black with red around it and finally a blue color around that. He was proud to have even created a bow, but suddenly the energy flared and he lost his focus. Soken Ishida created a barrier in a blink of an eye around Ichigo and stoked the energy from doing harm to anyone, Ichigo included. Well, that was a good try, he said with a shaky voice, obviously not having been sure what would happen. Can I try now? Verena asked excitedly. Of course. Soken answered, his eyes shining as he smiled at the small girl. Ichigo went back to standing next to Yuryu, who pushed his glasses up his nose as he spoke with a condescending voice. You lost focus, that's why it flared. Ichigo rolled his eyes at him. No kidding, he mumbled, sounding annoyed. You should quit. Yuryu said as they watched Verena create a true Quincy bow without any problem. Ichigo gawked at her bow with wide eyes as his jaw dropped at her ability to create one with ease. You may have Quincy blood, but you have a red spirit ribbon. Ichigo's confused look, he continued. Only Shinigami have those. Shut up. Ichigo growled at him with annoyance in his tone. Verena suddenly turned her eyes away from her target and looked at her brother, his face contorting into anger. Creating an arrow, she shot it. The arrow struck a boulder and went right through it, causing it to split in half. Calling away the bow, she went up to the two boys and pointed a finger at them. Stop arguing with each other or I'll bang your heads together, she yelled at them. Both boys felt sweat drip down their necks as Verena went back to stand next to Soken, who chuckled at her threat to the two boys before going on to the next part of the lesson. Kurosaki. Yuryu began, causing Ichigo to look at him. Your sister is a bit scary. Ichigo sighed. Try living with her. Ichigo countered. As much as I love having a twin, she can get too serious sometimes. Yuryu looked at him. I'll cut you some slack as long as you keep her from killing me, he said, looking completely serious. Say you'll help me understand this stuff too and you've got a deal. Ichigo countered with a grin. In other words, if Yuryu didn't agree to this amendment, he was on his own against Verena. Yuryu sighed but conceded to the terms. Agreed. The two boys stiffened when she eyed them with a glance behind her before returning her attention to whatever the older Quincy was saying. Sometimes Verena could be very frightening, even to Ichigo, and when it came to her learning something new, it was best to never get in between her and that. Ichigo charged right at Urahara. It was Saturday, which meant underground training. Like every weekend since their dad's death 2 months ago, both Verena and Ichigo had been coming to learn how to fight, to protect themselves and those around them. With a fake wooden sword in their hands they really couldn't cause too much damage to the shopkeeper. Tessai sat on one of the boulders with an apron on and a cup of tea in his hand as he sipped it. The black cat that followed the children around, Yoruchi, sat next to him watching both children chase after Kisuke with wooden swords. "They're getting faster," she said as she noticed the increased speed in both of the children. Not saying anything, Tessai looked down at her. "He's having fun," she said, noticing the slight smile on Kisuke's face. "The boss enjoys teaching." Tessai said in agreement. "Any news about what happened?" Cat eyes looked up at him. "Yes," her deep voice answered. "It seems that the Noble Council of Elders felt the explosion of Ryatsu and matched it to deceased Isshin Shiba." She watched as Ichigo suddenly tripped on his own 2 feet before standing up and running full throttle at Kisuke, who seemed shocked at the boy's sudden speed and strength. "They're launching an investigation due to the fact that Aizen reported his death nearly 14 years ago. 5 years before those two were even born. So keep an eye out," he inquired just as Ichigo sprung at Kisuke and snagged a leg, causing the shopkeeper to hop on one leg to try and dislodge the boy, only for Verena to grab onto the other. Yoruchi chuckled at the sudden look her old friend had upon his face. Total and utter defeat at having 2 adorable children grasping onto him. "Definitely," she said as she stood up, stretched out and then quickly ran off before the children noticed her. Kisuke may have looked busy, but he had seen Yoruchi with Tessai as he trained the children. When Ichigo had tripped, he had purposely slowed his speed down to allow the boy to catch up. Kisuke hadn't expected Ichigo to jump at him, neither had he expected the boy to have a crushing tight grip on his leg. Distraction seemed to be his downfall, as Verena had followed her twin's actions by grasping his other moments later, and he soon found his balance thrown off by both children refusing to move off of his legs and instantly fell onto his back. "Oof," he gasped as he saw both children laughing. Dual grins on their faces. Both gave each other a look before he found them pouncing on him like a predator on its prey, and it seemed his game of catch me if you can had suddenly turned into a tickle fest. Well, this was a game he could definitely get down with as he snuck both arms around the twins, tickled their sides relentlessly. Their laughter echoing throughout the training room. An hour later both children were upstairs eating a late lunch snack that Tessai had prepared as Urahara spoke to Masaki. "How are they doing?" she asked, wondering if they were gaining in strength or not. "Ichigo is a very fast learner," he told her as he sat down. "He makes a mistake once and learns quickly how to overcome it." He took his cup of tea and sipped it before continuing. "This is something that most don't learn so quickly, it takes years of overcoming mistakes, but Ichigo overcomes obstacles so much faster. Speaking of speed, he is very fast on his feet. Next week I'd like to test his endurance a bit more, to see how quickly he can move." "Verena?" she inquired as she heard sudden laughter as the twins did something in her absence. Urahara smiled. "Like Ichigo, she is fast, but she seems to follow her brother's lead." He then paused in thought before continuing. "Both have a ridiculous amount of spiritual power that's emanating from them." He pointed to his wrist. "I've given them both bracelets that will help hide away their power until it grows again, which it shouldn't for another year or 2. "How much power are we talking about?" she asked, remembering how strong Isshin had first been when she'd met him. He thought for a moment. How to put it in perspective? He sat his cup of tea in front of her. "This is an example," he told her. "This cup represents the normal amount of power in a spirituality active child." He picked up the teapot and sat it next to the cup. "This represents you children's powers." Her eyes widened at this. Grand Fisher was more than likely attracted because of this power that's flowing from them. He placed both the pot and cup back. I'm hoping to prevent that tragedy from happening again by placing these bracelets on them that will create a barrier around the children, stopping their spiritual energy from leaking around them. Hopefully this will stop both Hollow and Shinigami from sensing the children. Masaki suddenly thought of her other children. Would this happen to them too? What about Karen and Yuzu? Will this eventually happen to them as well? She asked him, fear in her eyes and worry in her voice. Truthfully, he wasn't sure. Shaking his head he answered. I don't know, he told her. Both girls show no signs of sensing spirits, and until they do, I have no idea of whether they'll need the training or the protections that their older siblings do need. Both adults sat in silence as they tried to figure out what would be best for the children and their future. Blood dripped onto the ground, causing the red liquid to stain the dirt. In front of Ichigo he could see a man with black hair wearing a long black jacket. Next to him another stood wearing black sunglasses. The two looked one and the same, but something was off about the older one. An evil presence was about him, making the hair on the back of Ichigo's neck stand on end. He suddenly felt an odd presence behind him. Turning his head, Ichigo saw that crazy kid standing with his back to him. Yo, King, the other greeted him. Who are those other two men? Ichigo asked. Usually it's just you here. A frown marred the other's face, causing the black/gold eyes to look oddly confused. There's only one other here, he told Ichigo. You saw the old one? Ichigo looked back to where he'd seen the two men but saw nothing now. There were two. One with sunglasses and the other looked evil. His white-haired doppelganger stood next to him. Well, they're gone now, he muttered. It's good you saw the one. A frown was still present on his face though. As for the other, that I don't know. Ichigo looked at the other boy. So, you're not trying to hurt me this time, he said this as an observation. Why are you always chasing me? TCH, the kid looked away from him towards another sideways building. I'm not chasing you, he told him. Liar. Ichigo said in a challenging tone, causing the other to stare at him with wide eyes. I think I may know, but I'm not sure. Ichigo heard another dripping sound in the distance. The ground began to turn red once again. Ichigo looked at the other. You'd at least have be able to see that. The white-haired boy looked down at the ground below the buildings and saw the ground turning red. His frown deepened. I don't like that, he mumbled. You've got to get stronger, King. Something big is coming, but I dash. You don't know what it is. Ichigo finished for him. I've been having odd dreams lately. This place included. The kid blinked at him before a grin appeared on his face. An echoing laugh came from him. It's not funny, he yelled at the white-haired boy. Sure it is, the other said with a wide smile. Well, why don't you dream about black-haired girls with pointy swords then, along with a crazy white-haired kid chasing you for no reason, he yelled at the other, who began snickering. Oh. And toss into that mix, monsters with masks that are trying to devour you and everyone you know. Ichigo threw up his hands in frustration before he ran them through his unruly orange hair. My life is so confusing and weird. Try being me, the other muttered quietly before he turned towards Ichigo and yelled. I'm bored in here. Give me something to fight or else I'm going to go ballistic. Arg. Ichigo yelled in frustration. Why must I fight? Because, the other grinned. You're a protector, King. It's just who you are. Ichigo suddenly found the odd world begin to fade away as he woke up in his bedroom. The bottom boards of the top bunk stared back at him. Pictures of him and Verena with goat face were plastered on the boards. In one it was just his parents smiling back at him. The 4 pictures had been taken on his and Verena's 9th birthday, just a few days before Goatface went and got himself killed. A protector. That's what he was or could become. It's what his name meant. Sitting up, Ichigo opened the window and looked out at his neighborhood. No spirits on this early Saturday morning, but he could definitely sense something in the air, but was unsure what it was. In Urahara's shoten, a blond man twirled his newsboy cap by the forefinger of his left hand as he waited in a spare room for his old friend to return when he suddenly heard a noise that sounded oddly like children laughing. Placing his hat on his head, he walked out of the room only to find two children with orange hair turned towards him. "Ah, Shinji, good you're here." Urahara's voice caught Shinji Hirako's attention. Shinji looked from the children to Urahara and was about to speak when the boy spoke up. "Whose piano mouth?" the kid asked, causing Shinji to look at him with annoyance written across his face. "Shinji is an old friend," Urahara stated as he pushed his strip bucket hat up slightly. "So he's a pervert like you, get a bushy," the boy said with a grin, obviously teasing the other man. Shinji snorted. "Get a bushy. It's so fit, Urahara." He suddenly froze as he realized what the kid had said. "Hey," he said with a whine. "I'm not a pervert," he pouted at this. The young girl giggled. "Ichi, be nice," she told him before turning her attention back to Urahara. "Are we doing more running today, Mr. Getabushi?" Urahara sighed in defeat. It was obvious that he wasn't going to ever get these two to call him anything other than that cursed name. "Not today," he told them. "I was hoping Hirako would join us. Mostly for your benefit, Ichigo." "Me?" the boy, Ichigo, asked with surprise in his voice. "Why? What did I do?" "Nothing," Urahara exclaimed. "It's the Ryatsu that I sensed last week when you tackled me. It wasn't just yours that was there." Ichigo suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Kisuke smiled as he saw how Ichigo was squirming. So the boy knew something. He'd had a feeling. "You want to tell me something?" he asked Ichigo as he bent forward so that he was looking at Ichigo at the boy's height. Ichigo avoided Urahara's gaze. "You sensed him too, didn't ya?" he asked. "Who is he?" the shopkeeper prodded. Ichigo shrugged. "I've got an idea, but I haven't asked him if it's right yet," Ichigo said. "He calls me king. He looks just like me, only with white hair and gold eyes. He also wears a white kosode and hakama with a black obi. He's crazy, but kind of cool." "Ah, King. Didn't think you thought I was cool." The echoing voice of the spirit spoke. His voice sounding like he was teasing Ichigo, but Ichigo knew that wasn't the case. Frowning, Ichigo looked towards Urahara. "He's not a bad guy," he told him. "He's just a kid, like me." "Sounds like either a Zanpakuto spirit," Shinji began, "or a hollow." He said this with a dark tone to his voice. Urahara stood up before rubbing his stubble on his chin. "Or perhaps both?" he inquired. "Shit." Ichigo heard the kid in his head curse. "He's annoyingly good." Ichigo chuckled, causing both to look at him. Shrugging his shoulders, he then felt Verena tap his shoulder, causing him to look at her. "Is he the reason for your bad dreams?" she inquired. "No," he said with a shake of his head. "I think those dreams are a remnant of something." Verena cocked her head. "A remnant from what?" she inquired. "A past life?" He heard the white-haired kid question. Even he didn't know where those weird-ass dreams were coming from. Ichigo shrugged. "A past life?" he asked with uncertainty. "What kind of dreams?" Urahara inquired out of curiosity as he opened the trap door to the training room/basement. "Of death. War mostly," he told the older man as they were led to the training room. "Of people in black outfits fighting people who look like Quincy's." He then paused for a moment, debating on telling the rest. When they arrived in the training room, he could tell they were waiting for the rest of it. "A really scary man that I know is evil is trying to kill me. He seems to succeed, but then a bright light appears and then I usually wake up." He scratched his head. "There's this really weird guy there too. He's got a beard, is round and fat. Almost thought he was gonna describe Hachi there for a minute." Shinji joked, causing a sly smile to cross Kisuke's face. Ichigo frowned. No, he told them, causing both to look down at the boy. His name is Ichigo. Shock crossed both men's faces as they both knew exactly who the boy was talking about. But how it possible that he even knew the name of one of the members of Zero Squad, was a mystery to both men. It's official, Verena began as she punched her fist into Ichigo's shoulder. My brother is weird. I am not. Indigo yelled at her, his face flushing. R2, she yelled back. You see spirits, both the good and bad ones, she pointed out at him. But that's okay, she giggled. I'm weird too. Indigo flushed. Yeah, you're definitely weird, he mumbled only to get punched again. Hey, he cried out, swiping his palm at her, only for Verena to dodge him. The two then began a game of chase. You are crazy to be training those two. Shinji muttered before lifting his cap to scratch his head. I must be crazy too for even considering in helping train that boy. Urahara hummed as he was now deep in thought. One question, how do you think he knew that name? He inquired from his old friend. Urahara watched the two children fight for a moment before answering. I don't know. Shinji turned his attention to the two siblings before summing up his thoughts. That's scary, he admitted, because for once it would seem Urahara Kisuke was stumped by something. Verena yawned as she sat in math class listening to the teacher drone on. Ichigo looked like he was about to pass out himself as Yuryu was busy taking notes behind him. Grinning, Verena couldn't believe that those two had teamed up together over the last 2 years of their training. Since Quincy training was easier for her than it was for Ichigo, she supposed it made sense. It also gave Ichigo a male family member to pick on other than herself. The two bickered like an old married couple some days. It was fine with her though, after all, it allowed her to focus on her own training. Suddenly the door to the classroom opened to reveal a tall kid that looked to be 16 or perhaps older. The teacher turned towards the young man and took the paper he handed to him. The teacher gave a sigh. Students, it would seem we have received a new transfer student. He looked at the boy. Go ahead, introduce yourself. I'm Yasutora Sato, he said as he stood there towering over everyone. I've been living in Mexico and only just returned. Couple of the boys behind Verena began talking about inviting Sato to play on the basketball team or see if he was any good at soccer. She nodded at their choice of a teammate. Their team would definitely have an advantage if he was any good. She watched the darker-skinned boy walk by with his chocolate-colored hair. He was a cutie, but she wished she could see his eyes better. Verena blushed at those thoughts before grasping her textbook and avoiding any eye contact with anyone until after class was over. She really needed to beat something up. A week later Verena came across a scene after school that had her smiling. Ichigo was laying on his back holding something up at Sato, who was tied up. Walking over to the two boys just as Ichigo was undoing the ropes around the new student, Verena saw the group of thugs that were beat up and unconscious. Looks like you've been having all the fun, Ichi, she joked at him. Chad, this is my twin sister Verena, he said before glaring at her. You know I don't go out looking for trouble. Verena waved her hand at him. Of course not, it just comes finding you. Exactly, he agreed with a grin on his face. Sister, they both heard Sato question. Yeah. We look exactly alike, except he has a penis, she pointed at Ichigo who began sputtering. Don't say that out loud, he yelled feeling embarrassed as his cheeks flushed. What? She asked confused. It's not like you have dash. He slapped a hand over her mouth. Don't say it, he growled. Verena stuck her tongue out to lick his hand and grinned loudly as he yanked it away. You're too easy to rile up, Ichi, she giggled. Turning away she looked over her shoulder. You two coming? Sure. Ichigo said as he wiped his hand on his jacket just as the ambulances began arriving with the police. You'd think the gangs would learn to stop picking fights with you, she stated as they passed them by. You're always kicking their asses. Ichigo grinned. Well, this time I didn't start it, he said with a shrug. I couldn't let them hurt Chad. My name dash, Sato begun to correct them. Well, perhaps Chad needs to learn when to hop into a fight if you're gonna be protecting him, she said. Ichigo laughed. We just made an agreement. I'll use my fists to protect his back as long as he does the same. Verena looked at Sato. Do you even know how to fight Chad? She inquired when she saw him give a sigh. Yes, he told her, feeling insulted she'd think otherwise. Verena grinned. Great. Then you can come to Urahara's Shoten with us, as she turned down the road towards the shopkeeper's store. Eh? Ichigo questioned as Sato looked between them questioningly. What? She asked Ichigo. I don't think dash, he began. Then don't, she grinned as he glared at her. Is this how all siblings act with each other? Sato thought to himself before smiling at how Verena teased Ichigo, who always seemed to take the bait. They seemed to enjoy teasing each other. He continued to walk silently behind them as the two siblings picked and teased each other. Urahara scratched his head as he looked between the two preteens to the giant of a boy that stood between them. So, you want to train with them? He asked the boy. Before Sato could answer, Verena spoke. He says he's going to watch Ichi's back from now on, as Ichi is going to watch his back, she explained before pointing at Ichigo. He kicked the butts of a dozen grown-ass men. Albeit they were just a bunch of gangsters trying to hassle Chad, but still. Look at him. Ichigo scratched the back of his head. Okay, they got a few lucky strikes in, he admitted. But it's not like I'm laying on the ground in pain moaning for my mama, he told her. Sato sighed. I want to help Ichigo, he said, causing Urahara to smirk. He could definitely sense something from this young man, but what that something was, he wasn't quite certain. Bringing out his paper fan, he chuckled. You're in luck, he said cheerfully. I'm willing to take on more students. The more the merrier, he then looked at the young man with a serious look. I just hope you understand what it means to be their friend. This caused the twins to grin at the shopkeeper. Yuryu climbed the last stone boulder to the clearing where he was meeting his grandfather for some special training when he heard a sudden noise. Reaching out his senses, he felt a disturbance ahead of him. Running forward, pulling his Quincy cross out, he prepared himself for whatever was ahead of him. Hollows were attacking his grandfather, who was outnumbered by the monsters. Fear crippled the young boy. He couldn't move, let alone create a bow to help in protecting his grandfather. He watched in sorrow as Soken fell to the ground dead. Hiding himself behind a tree, Yuryu prayed for the monsters to leave. Screeches were heard along with death cries. Peering around a tree, he saw some men in lab coats and wearing Shinigami clothes. On the ground was his grandfather, bleeding out. Nausea hit him as he placed a hand over his mouth to stop himself from making any noise. His grandfather was dead. Why hadn't those men shown up sooner? He wondered. They could have saved his life. Fisting his hand, Yuryu felt anger unlike anything before slam into him. Grandfather. He watched them pick up his grandfather's body and leave through a senkamen. Yuryu felt his legs give out from under him, as he slid down the tree he'd been hiding behind. His shoulders began to shake uncontrollably. Ever since his mother's sudden death, he'd lost a connection with his father. He had nobody now that his grandfather was dead. I'm alone. He thought as tears threatened to fall down his cheeks. I can't let them get away with this. He fisted his hands once again. I'll get stronger, then I'll kill the Shinigami. An image of Ichigo and Verena appeared in his mind. His fisted slackened. I can't hurt them. They've done nothing to deserve that. He then recalled the red ribbon wrapped around both of them. They're Quincy's, but they're also Shinigami. He leaned his head back against the tree trunk. What do I do? The wind began to blow around him, causing Yuryu to feel the cold come over him. I'll have to tell Ryukin, he said to nobody but himself. He won't do nothing. He never does. Standing, Yuryu began the long trek back to the city, all the while thinking of how he'd get his revenge for his grandfather's death. Ichigo woke up in the sideways world that he now knew was his inner world. On one of the skyscrapers not too far away he could see his white doppelganger standing looking off into the distance. Jumping from his own perch and running towards the other, he came to a sudden stop. "Been a while, King," the pale version of himself said. On his back was a sword that was wrapped in bandages. "That's new," Ichigo thought as he looked at it. Noticing what Ichigo was looking at, the hollow doppelganger laughed, his voice echoing creepily. "Like it, King?" he asked. "You're not ready to use it yet, but you're getting close," he smiled. "Wanna play?" "TCH." Ichigo snorted. "You'll cheat again," he complained as he placed his arms over his chest. The hollow laughed once again. "When's Piano Mouth coming back?" he asked as he changed the subject. Ichigo grinned at the doppelganger's nickname for Shinji. "Not sure, but he said he was bringing a friend this time." The hollows got wider, if possible. "This is gonna be fun, King." Ichigo grinned as he too thought that whoever Shinji was bringing would make training even more fun. "I agree." In the distance a black-cloaked man watched the two talk from his perch on a pole. His eyes were covered by dark sunglasses even though the sun barely shone in the inner world of his young master. He stayed silent as he watched the boy interact with the white-haired hollow. Even though most saw hollows as monsters, this boy saw his hollow as a friend and ally. He wondered how his young master was going to react and that once longtime ally would one day attack him in order to make their master stronger. It was something he looked forward to witnessing. Masaki smiled as the morning light came through the curtains. The small shrine she had been praying at in her home was decorated with mementos and pictures of her beloved husband Isshin, whom she missed dearly. She had been trying her best to remain happy for her precious children over the last 6 years. Verena and Ichigo were both aspiring fighters, Verena taking after herself as Ichigo was very slowly morphing into Isshin. Both had their father's loud qualities, though Ichigo had a quiet streak. Verena was a Quincy with some Shinigami powers and Ichigo seemed to becoming a strong Shinigami. She had yet to see Ichigo create a true Quincy bow and hold on to its form for more than a minute. However, it would seem both of her children had inherited her blood veine ability. Ichigo still used it without actually thinking about it, while Verena could actually activate the defensive ability. "Our children are so strong, Isshin," she thought as she sat at his shrine. "You'd be so proud of them." She felt tears begin to fall down her cheeks. Especially Ichigo. He called out his sword's name yesterday during training. "Zenjutsu is rightfully named after your sword, my love. I worry for him though. I worry that Soul Society will take notice as he is still becoming stronger." She folded her hands over her chest before taking a deep breath and closed the shrine cupboard doors. Standing, Masaki walked into the kitchen. It was Ichigo and Verena's birthday today. So it was time to cook their morning breakfast, her special pancakes. Mixing the batter as the oil heated, Masaki smiled brightly as she heard thumping noises above her head along with Ichigo's indignant outcry as Verena beat him to the bathroom this morning. A moment later there were more outcries as Karen and Yuzu tackled Ichigo in the hallway. Their brother's noises of laughter let her know what the twins were doing. The laughter turned into cries as something else occurred. A moment later Ichigo came down with disheveled bed hair with Yuzu slung over his shoulder and Karen under his left arm. "Mom!" Both girls cried out before Ichigo dropped Karen onto the nearby couch as Yuzu was placed at the breakfast nook counter. Ichigo came around and looked at breakfast. "Need help?" he asked. "No." Yuzu cried out. "You'll burn it, big brother," she pouted at him, obviously not wanting crispy pancakes for breakfast. "You're outnumbered this morning, son," she smiled as a chuckle escaped his lips. "I guess," he said as he scratched the back of his neck. He then took several glasses out of the cupboard and began to fill them with orange juice. Verena came downstairs with wet hair, her brush in hand and dirty clothes. "Shower is open," she announced just as Ichigo finished placing the cups at the table. Ichigo rushed ahead of the twins who gave yells at him, jumping 3 steps at a time. Verena chuckled as she came around the counter and hugged her mother. "Morning, Mom." Masaki smiled down at her daughter. "Good morning," she then began to pour the batter into the skillet. "Need help?" Verena asked as she brushed the knots out of her long hair before she put it in a quick braid. "I've got it, dear," she assured her daughter as she flipped the pancakes. "Okay." Verena began to set the plates out, noticing that the forks were already in place. She then got the sugar and syrup out of the refrigerator and cupboard. Pulling out her art book, she began to finish off the finishing touches of her picture for class, just as Ichigo came back down after a quick shower. Ichigo peered over her shoulder. "Art class?" he asked. "History." Verena told him before glaring at him. "You've got the same assignment, Ichi." He began as he scratched his temple. "I do?" he asked, sounding confused. "Really, Ichi?" she asked as she began to get upset. "I'll doodle something later today," he assured her as he sat across from her at the table. Masaki stayed quiet as she listened to the two. Verena could sometimes be a lot harder on Ichigo than she ever could be, but if it was something she needed to speak up in, she would say something. "Ichi, do you even know what the assignment was?" He gave Verena a confused look before looking at her picture. Sighing, she gave him the rundown of the assignment. Karen and Yuzu appeared just as the pancakes were placed on the table, along with 2 gifts. Verena and Ichigo grinned at their mother before snatching up the presents and devouring their breakfast. Verena smiled happily as she bounced a little bit as her new earring sparkled. Next to her, Ichigo was looking at his new watch. "Think Chad will already be at Getabushi's?" she asked him. Ichigo looked away from his new watch towards his sister. "No," he said, knowing his sister was developing a bit of a crush on his friend. "You know he's not interested in you like that." Verena blushed at her brother's words. "I know," she said, looking away. "I think Karen can see spirits now," she told him, trying to change the subject. "I know," he said with a grave look in his eyes. "I've noticed her spirit pressure getting higher lately. We'll have to see about getting Getabushi to train her," Verena stated as they turned a corner that led to the shopkeeper's place. "I was thinking more along the lines of getting Tensai to train her," Ichigo said before pulling his phone out of his pocket. Verena raised an eyebrow at him. "Just Kigo," he told her with a roll of his eyes. "He's a bit of an oddball," she mumbled. "So why Tensai? Her Ryatsu seems high enough that she could become a Kido expert in no time at all," he said with a grin. "You suck at Kido," she said with a tease. Ichigo glared at her. "So what?" he yelled, feeling a bit of his pride being hit by that. Verena laughed. "Well, at least you know the name of your sword," she countered, calming him down. "Still can't hear yours?" he asked as they came to a stop in front of Urahara's Shoten. Verena looked at him. "I'm not the one who has been talking to one half of my sword for 6 years, she told him. Yeah, he agreed. "It took me a while to get that both those spirits are Zangetsu." "Was it really that hard?" she inquired. Ichigo leaned back against the wood fence that went along the store property. "White Zangetsu never told me, but I guessed what he was," he said as he leaned his head back. "Old man Zangetsu kind of freaked me out a few times." "Why?" Verena inquired, wanting to see if his experience could help her. Ichigo looked at her with a dark and gloomy look in his eyes. "Because he almost looks like the guy from my dreams that will kill me one day," he said before sensing something. Looking to his left, he saw Yoruchi in her cat form. "Yoruchi," he greeted her. "You look upset," the cat woman stated, having observed the two since they arrived. Ichigo closed his eyes as a cocked grin appeared on his face. "Not really," he said, wanting to avoid that conversation. "If you say so," the former Kido Corps captain said as she walked away towards the back of the Shoten, both teens following her. So if you're not upset. It's our birthday today. Verena stated, trying to help her brother out with this one. Oh. Yoruichi asked with a Cheshire grin on her face. I didn't know that. Ichigo felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Liar, he said with a suspicious look appearing on his face. Yoruichi was about to argue that when Verena piped in. We know everybody is here, she said as she picked the black cat up. Besides, nothing gets by you, Yoruichi, she said a little smugly. True. Yoruichi agreed as they entered the backyard where a party had been set up for the twins by the Vizarts and Urahara. About damn time, screeched a short blonde-haired girl who was wearing a red jacket over her white t-shirt. I'm hungry. Shinji began as he stood up from the back porch. What? She yelled at him, a flip-flop ready to be thrown was in hand. The weapon was suddenly snagged by the dark-haired girl next to her. Lisa, she yelled. Quiet down, she told the other girl. Where's Kessie and Love? Ichigo inquired as he decided to sit down next to Shinji. Went to get more food with Tessai. Urahara stated from the back door. Ichigo looked behind himself towards the shopkeeper. Oh, okay, he said. Are you okay, Ichigo? Another blonde man inquired from a lawn chair across from him. I'm fine, Rose, he assured. Why is everybody asking that? He was beginning to feel agitated. We worry is all. Shinji assured him with a tap on his shoulder. How about I give you both my presents? Urahara asked as he held up two small boxes. Verena and Ichigo felt sweat drip down their necks. Last year the shopkeeper had given them a vacation giveaway that turned out to be a week's worth of training with the monks in the mountains. It had been the worst gift ever. Why, you didn't have to? Verena stuttered nervously. Yeah. Ichigo agreed with a nervous nod. Nonsense. Urahara placed the two gifts in each of their hands. Yoruichi jumped onto the table with a chuckle at the look of apprehension from the twins. Damn it. Ichigo cursed as he gave in first and opened the gift. Inside was a silver ring with a red stone placed in the setting. It was a simple design meant for men, so it wasn't gaudy. Ichigo placed it on his forefinger and smiled. Nice. Thanks, he looked at his sister who was looking over a charm bracelet she'd been given. Lisa was helping her put it on. Not bad. Shinji said with a nod as he saw instantly what those pieces of jewelry were doing. What? Ichigo inquired as he looked between his two mentors. Ichi, your Ryatsu is gone. Verena stated with a bit of alarm in her voice. While in human form, those pieces of jewelry will help hide your Ryatsu from everybody and anything that can sense it. Urahara said with a little bit of pride. It's taken me a few years to get them to work like I wanted, but finally they're doing what they were designed for. You said human form. Verena said, pointing out his wording. Indeed, I did say that, he said with a grin as his eyes peeked out from under his hat at them. In soul form they'll help amplify your powers, including Kido, he then pointed at Ichigo. However, you need to stay away from high-power Kido spells until you're able to control them without that ring. Yeah. Ichigo waved at him to stop him from worrying. I know that already. Just then the others arrived with the meat that was to be grilled upon the grill. The party really began to get started after that. Hiyori yelling at Kessie as Shinji tried, without success, to stop her from starting a fight with the former captain. Ichigo looked at the older man with cornrows in his hair. Tessai, I was wondering if you could teach my sister some Kido, he asked. Tessai looked over at Verena. She seems to be doing fine with learning from the boss, he told the young man. Not Verena, he said trying to correct himself. It's Karen. Her Ryatsu is beginning to get a little high. Veer and I are certain she can see spirits by now. Probably has for a while too. The other man touched his chin in thought. I see, he gave a nod. I can teach her some defensive techniques until the boss can create her something like what you and Verena got today. Ichigo sighed in relief. Thanks. He then turned towards the party and watched everyone joking and talking with each other. It was nice, but something had him on edge. As darkness came over the town as the duo walked home, Ichigo could sense change was coming and with it, danger. Ichigo could sense something on the wind. Within his mind he could see both of his spirits. His hollow seemed edgy today as well. Hopping from foot to foot, as if anticipating a fight. The dark-haired, old man, spirit looked off in the distance with a look that told Ichigo that he too sensed something on the horizon. Coming back to the present, Ichigo smiled at Verena, who he could tell sensed something just now as well. Off in the distance a Senkaman opened from Soul Society. A single figure came out of it and stood overlooking the city of Karakura town. Off in the distance a hollow screech could be heard. An instant later the figure vanished from sight. Walking home from school was never a dull thing when it came to either of the twins, whether it be Ichigo and Verena or Karen and Yuzu. However, unlike the older pair, the younger were less violent in taking care of bullies, usually. Today the two sets had met halfway home, unusual because the twin girls usually had after-school activities that they joined in on. As they turned down their street they came in contact with a group of boys that were standing around, but it was Ichigo that suddenly got upset. On the side of the street was a vase with a flower that had been tipped on its side. A child spirit stood nearby looking frightened. Karen pushed Yuzu to the side where the spirit was as Ichigo proceeded to begin beating the teens up. Question 1. What the heck is that? He yelled at the boys that stood dumbfounded at seeing their friends getting beat up by an orange-haired kid. You there, stinky-looking one. The older boy pointed at himself. Me? He asked. All three girls could have facepalmed at his question. An offering to the kid who died here recently, he answered with a question. Great answer. Ichigo stated as he did a flying kick to the face of the larger teen sending him sprawling on the ground. MIT. Bro dashed it, his friend began only to be interrupted. Question 2. Ichigo yelled gaining the 3 of the 4 punks' attentions. MIT, the skinny friend questioned his friend to see if he was okay. Then why is the vase? Ichigo began as he glared at the group of boys. Knocked over. All the boys began to feel nervous. Who was this kid? Could he be one of those people? That's 'cause we knocked it over, the skinny kid answered. While skateboarding. I see. Ichigo's voice sounded dark and dangerous. Then shouldn't you apologize to her? He yelled while pointing to the child standing close to him. Her face was bloody and clothes stained from being injured, though the boys couldn't see her. Otherwise. Verena began as she put her 2 cents in. She may begin to haunt you and drag you to hell with her, she said darkly. All 4 young men fell to the ground in fear. I'm sorry, they began repeating over and over. We won't do it again. They then turned and ran from the Kurosaki twins. Yuzu burst out laughing next to Karen. The spirit child giggled as well as the boys vanished down the street. TCH. Ichigo groaned as he picked up the vase and flower. Sorry I had to use you like that. It's okay, she told them. You were the one to bring me flowers in the first place, she said. It's only right that I cooperate in the end. I'll bring you some flowers soon, he promised the child as he waved goodbye to her. Thanks mister, she grinned. Now I can spend my time quietly. As they neared home, Yuzu grasped Ichigo's hand. Looking down as she looked up at him, Ichigo gave her a grin as she gave him one. Looking up at the old sign that read Kurosaki Clinic, Ichigo felt a deep ache within himself. He wondered what Goatface would have said or how he would have reacted had he learned of the many things he and Verena could do now. Protecting spirits was only one of many things they did these days. Grinning, he could practically hear him making jokes about it. We're home, he announced as he opened the door. You're late. He looked up to see his mother standing in the hallway before suddenly she hugged all 4 of them at once. Mom. Mother. Arg, Mom. Each child began to groan out at the embarrassing hug, though they secretly enjoyed it. Seriously though, did she have to always hug them when they arrived late? It was Yuzu's fault. Karen stated. Naha. Yuzu said in defense. You wanted to wait for Ichi and Veer, she told everyone. Karen flushed. Did not, she yelled before turning on her heel and running upstairs. Is something going on with her? Masaki asked her two eldest, who gave each other a look. We think she's beginning, if not already, to be able to see spirits. Verena answered as she sat her book bag on the floor. Stretching out, she grasped the hair tie in her hair and pulled it out. Her long orange hair cascaded down her back. I'll go talk to her, she told her mother as she walked up the stairs after Karen. Karen has been able to see spirits for a while. Yuzu stated as she began to stir the hot pot on the stove. Pulling a chair out at the breakfast nook, Ichigo sat on the stool. How long? He inquired, worry eating at him as he fingered the ring on his hand. Yuzu thought as she blew the spoon before licking it. A year, she answered. I'm just beginning to see blurry images myself, but they don't look like anything to me, she pouted. Ichigo stretched his senses out and sure enough could tell that Yuzu's spiritual pressure was beginning to rise, but not by much. Frowning, he stood up and grasped a piece of bread and dipped it into the soup before leaving both his mother and sister to finish up dinner as he got to watch television for a moment. Taking his ring off, Ichigo looked at the gem within it and wondered just how this tiny thing could possibly block all his power from escaping. Upstairs, Karen was still fuming. Why am I even mad? She asked herself as she sat on the bed. It's not like it's not true. So why did I? Her thoughts came to a sudden screeching halt as a woman in a black hakama and top came through the wall of her bedroom. Who the hell? She began as the woman spoke. What dash was all Karen could say as she stood suddenly, the strange woman looking around her room and walked right past her. It's near, she said, not even seeming to notice Karen in the room. Annoyed as she was, Karen picked up her soccer ball and yelled, near my ass, and kicked the ball hitting the strange woman in the back of her head. Are you a burglar? She asked angrily. It doesn't matter. Get the hell out of my room. Why you can see me? The black-haired woman asked as she looked at Karen while rubbing the back of her head. I mean, you just up with a ball. She looked confused as she looked between the object that had hit her and Karen. Now it was Karen's turn to be confused. What the heck are you talking about? She asked. Of course I can see you. Wasn't that obvious? The door suddenly opened. Karen. Verena yelled happily, I just dash. Can you see her? Karen asked her sister. Verena turned her head towards the young woman on the floor. Of course she could. Normal humans cannot see me, the woman explained to Karen. I am a Shinigami. Verena shut the door behind her and walked up to the black-haired woman and touched her shoulder and leaned forward. I guess you could say, she began before her voice turned a bit darker. I'm not a normal human either. The woman's eyes widened further as she felt a sudden presence that was unlike any other she'd ever felt. Those in this house. She thought. Such power. But how? Verena rubbed the bridge of her nose as Karen spoke. So you say you are Shinigami, who came from Soul Society to exterminate an evil spirit? The woman on the ground nodded. Like I'd believe that shit. You can see spirits but you don't believe in Shinigami? The woman asked flabbergasted. In the year that I've seen the spirits, not once have I ever seen a Shinigami. Karen yelled. Then she paused before looking at Verena. Are they real? Of course we're real, the woman yelled out, seeming to be getting annoyed. You spewing nonsense. She suddenly moved her hands in a way that Verena had seen Kisuke and Tessai do when using Kido. First restraint. Obstruction. Karen cried out as suddenly her arms felt tied to her back. Crying out in more fear than pain, she fell to the floor. Shit. Verena rushed over to her sister. It's okay, Karen, don't be scared, she said. This is a type of keto. Just don't move. Karen tried calming herself down. Oh okay, she mumbled. Verena heard the sound of a sword releasing from its sheath. Damn it. She'd gone and given the Shinigami woman a perfect target. Her back. How do you know of keto? She asked Verena, her eyes narrowing at her. Verena smirked. Shinigami aren't the only things out there, she answered as she popped into her mouth a tiny pill. Separating from her body, Verena was in her own spirit form. She looked like a Shinigami, but with a white and blue cloak on her shoulders that stopped at her knees. It held the Quincy cross upon its sleeves and back. I am a Quincy/Shinigami. In her hand was a glowing white bow, as on her hip was a sword with a chain wrapped around it and its sheath, as if it was sealed away. The Shinigami's eyes widened. A Quincy and a Shinigami? Shinigami are real. Karen realized as she watched her older sister confront the other woman. And my sister is one of them. Of course she knew about her older siblings' Quincy training, but she'd never heard anything about Shinigami. Why had that part been hidden from me? A sudden screech was heard, shaking the entire house. What was that? Karen screamed, gaining the attention of both women in the room. The black-haired woman felt her breath escape her. A hollow, she gasped. You let a hollow here. Verena yelled at the woman. I've got 2 other siblings and our mother. You bitch. Why didn't you pay attention? I don't have to answer to you, Quincy, the woman yelled at her. Veer. Ichigo suddenly came into the room and came to a screeching halt when he saw the Shinigami in the room. What the hell? He questioned his sister when he saw Karen on the floor. Fuck. Verena held her hand up at her brother. I've got this. Go protect Mom and Yuzu, she told him, her eyes never leaving the Shinigamis. A scream had both siblings suddenly freeze. It was Yuzu's. Yuzu. Karen screamed as she stood up, sweat breaking out across her face. Such spiritual pressure. The woman thought as she watched the girl struggle to remain standing. Stop it, she yelled at the girl. You cannot break that incantation with a human's power. Your soul will dash, she gasped as suddenly the keto spell she had used was destroyed by Karen's will to get up and help her sister. As Karen ran off, both Ichigo and Verena smiled at each other. Told you so, he said to Verena. She acquiesced as they followed their sister and the Shinigami downstairs. This was about to turn out to be an interesting evening after all. In Urahara's candy store, 2 children and 2 adults froze at the sudden feel of a hollow's power as a familiar power began to rise near the clinic where a very special family lived. Tipping his hat back, Urahara Kisuke looked up at the clear night sky and sighed. It would seem things were about to begin to get complicated once again. Ah well, I've been waiting for something like this to happen for a while. He thought. Should be interesting as to who was sent this time. He grasped his cane, just in case it was needed, and began the short journey to the Kurosaki household. Having a 3 to 4 month assignment in the world of the living from her captain, Rukia Kachiki had found it mostly uneventful. She slept outside, or in a dilapidated building when it stormed at night. She still hadn't mastered any of the packages that humans placed their foods or drinks in yet, but her main concern was the enormous amount of spiritual energy that was in her assigned area of Karakura Town, a small suburb outside the city of Tokyo. On this evening, her soon-to-be last night in the world of the living, she'd been tacking a hollow, but as soon as she entered a community area where a bunch of homes were, she lost it. Jumping from home to home, she was about to give up for the night when she was slammed by a huge amount of Ryatsu. Tracking the energy output, she found a small 2-story home with a clinic next to it. Jumping into the first room, she found that the energy was strong there, but it was even stronger on the other side of the wall opposite of her. Passing through the wall, she found that there was a single occupant, but surely the energy wasn't coming from a human. She was wrong. How can this be? Rukia wondered as she looked between the three humans in the room. Shinigami and Quincy's are enemies. We don't get along. So it has to be impossible for children to be born between us, and yet. She looked at the two orange-haired teenagers. Undoubtedly both of these two are hybrids, but how? She then yelled at the raven-haired girl as she began to struggle within the incantation she had upon her. Stop it. What are you doing? She watched in horror as the young girl stood on shaking legs. If you force it, your soul will dash. She froze as she watched the girl break her incantation. How? She thought as the girl ran out of the room. The two orange-haired teens smiled at each other. To release a Keto form with human power? She questioned as she turned to follow the others. I have never heard of such a ridiculous thing. She saw the boy suddenly swallow a small pill. As he popped out of his body, Rukia's eyes widened like saucers. He has a Shihakusho. Her mind went blank for a moment from shock, her jaw slightly ajar. But how? She eyed the young man. His Shihakusho was a bit different from hers or any other Shinigami she knew of. Yes, he had the standard black garment, but what threw her off was the white garment around his hips that crossed over his chest and was held on by a shoulder pad on his left shoulder. It looks like part of a captain's haori. He also had a ridiculously large sword upon his back, and a second shorter sword upon his hip. Two Zanpakutos? She questioned, her mind going to her own captain and his two swords. Dual spirits. That's what she'd heard once. That to have a true dueling Zanpakuto that it meant you had to have two spirits within your sword. How strong is this boy? Khan, she heard the boy yell out, causing his body to jump up. Protect mom. He then took off after the young girl with his sister following close behind him. Geesh. Can't I even say hi? The young man's body looked at her before seeming to get nervous. Mod soul, she stuttered out loud. How many surprises was she going to witness tonight? The soul suddenly grinned and rubbed the back of his head nervously. You've heard of them, he said before turning to where the others had gone. Shouldn't you follow Shinigami? He pointed towards the door before turning towards Masaki. Hey mom, it's Khan. Can I eat while Ichigo goes to kill some hollows? Rukia stared in shock at the mod soul. Just what is going on here? She turned towards the open door and rushed out. I'll demand answers afterwards. She decided as she exited the home and found herself staring at a huge hollow holding a young child within its hands. Yuzu, the raven-haired girl screamed, the bat in her hand shaking slightly from her fear. Ready Ichigo? The teenage girl inquired. Rukia watched the young man smile towards her. Anytime Verena, he answered her. Verena. Ichigo. Rukia repeated their names in her mind. I must remember them in order to report them to Captain Yukatake. Idiots, she yelled. This is my job. Both looked at her, though it was the male who answered. They're our family, he said with a look of determination in his brown eyes. We'll protect them, but give you the hollow to kill. Karen, stay where you are. Verena yelled as she ran past the younger girl. Pulling her bow back, she concentrated on where she was aiming her shot. 6 arrows formed as she released them, the shots hitting and destroying the arm that held Yuzu as Ichigo jumped into the air and caught his youngest sister as she fell from the monster's grasp. She didn't destroy it. Rukia saw the arm disintegrating as it fell. The hollow released a yell of pain at having its arm destroyed. It's still alive. It's yours, Shinigami. Ichigo told her as he sat Yuzu down onto the ground. Yuzu? Karen cried out. Don't lose focus, girl. Rukia yelled at her. Your sister's soul is still intact. The hollow didn't eat it. So hollows eat the souls. Karen paused. Why didn't it eat her soul? She asked as she looked between her siblings and the Shinigami woman. Hollows wander searching for souls with high spiritual pressure. Rukia stated as she raised her sword to fight the hollow. For that, some weak humans are attacked that I have never seen, nor heard of a human who could see, or defeat Lisp on their own. She eyed Karen. Its target was most probably you because of your high spirit pressure. She then looked at the teens. But why it couldn't sense you too, I don't know. Even I cannot. So this that is my fault? Karen inquired as she looked at her injured and unconscious twin. Her eyes widening in horror. My fault? It's my fault Yuzu is hurt. Tears began to form. Hey! Ichigo yelled angrily. Wait. I did not mean. Rukia turned towards the girl with concern when suddenly a giant hand slapped her away across the street and into the fences. Shinigami. Ichigo and Verena yelled out in shock, never seeing Karen run off down the street to get away from everybody. To neglect defending my back before an enemy. Rukia thought as she slowly stood back up. I was careless, she muttered more to herself than to anyone else. Hey! You! You want my soul? Everyone turned in horror as they saw Karen standing in the center of the street trying to gain the hollow's attention. Then fight me and leave them out of this. Too good of an opportunity to waste, the hollow charged her to kill the impudent human and eat its precious soul. Fool! Rukia cried out as Verena pulled her bow back just as Ichigo Flash stepped away. Grasping Karen in his arms, Ichigo held up his larger Zanpakuto and blocked the hollow's attack. As a second attack came down upon him, Rukia jumped into the fray to cut its head off. Instead the hollow threw its fist at her, punching her through her gut. Blood splattered onto the ground and the fence behind her as she was flung to the side of the road like a rag doll. Shinigami! Karen cried out. Fool! Rukia muttered softly. It's not, Shinigami, she groaned as the pain became intense. It is Rukia Kuchiki. In front of her, Ichigo smirked. I see. I'm Ichigo Kurosaki. Rukia felt her eyes widen when he spoke. Verena Kurosaki. Verena spoke as she held her attack, waiting for Ichigo's signal. I'm Karen Kurosaki. Karen said. Ichigo grinned at them all. Let's pray this doesn't become our last greeting. For all of us, he told her as he swung his blade and blocked the hollow's attack easily. It gave a screech which Rukia heard as she was beginning to lose consciousness from blood loss. She then heard Ichigo yell, Getsuga Tensho. An arch of dark power flew out of the giant blade. At the same moment a blinding light exploded from Verena's bow as she shot a single large arrow that penetrated the darkness. The combination of the two attacks destroyed the hollow instantly. As darkness began to Rukia's senses, she had a feeling of something powerful coming from the young man she had just felt. That power, that spiritual pressure of his. Could it be so high that I cannot sense it? As her eyes closed she wondered. This guy, exactly, who is he? As the dust settled, Ichigo looked over towards the unconscious Shinigami. Rukia Kuchiki, huh? He thought before a grin crossed his features. She's going to regret meeting us. Suddenly sensing something he turned his head. Midnight walk Getabushi, he asked, gaining a grin from the ever-mysterious shopkeeper. Oh, I thought I sensed something going on, was his calm answer as he walked over to the unconscious Shinigami woman. What do we have here? He began examining her wounds. Her Ryatsu is completely diminished. Will she live? Ichigo inquired when he suddenly felt Karen tug the sleeve of his shihakusho. Urahara? Urahara looked up from the deep wound that the Shinigami soldier had. Suffered to look at Ichigo only for his eyes to come to rest upon Karen. Oh dear, he said softly as he sensed the Ryatsu pouring from the young girl. You should have mentioned this sooner. He then turned his head towards the road behind him just as a vehicle came to a stop and Tessai stepped out of the driver's side of the old truck. We shall take the Shinigami. Bring Miss Karen by tomorrow after school, he told the teen before looking towards the house. Tessai will come by to help fix up the damages later tonight, he told Ichigo as Tessai picked the Kachiki girl up and placed her in the back of the truck. As they drove off, Verena placed her hand upon Karen's head. "Exciting night," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "Were you two ever going to tell me about the Shinigami shit?" she inquired as she crossed her arms over her chest. "Yeah, after you came into your powers," Verena said sincerely. Ichigo sighed as he stepped in front of Karen. "What we do is very dangerous, Karen," he explained. "You could have died tonight because we never properly informed you of anything." He bowed his head in shame. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, whatever," she mumbled as she turned her head away from looking at Ichigo. "Just next time there's something important that I need to know, tell me," she yelled at them as they walked back over to where they had left Yuzu, only to find their mother, Kon, and Verena's soul mod waiting for them by the unconscious girl. After switching back, the siblings waited for Yuzu to wake up before relaying what exactly had happened that night and gave Yuzu and Karen the story of who their father really was, what a Shinigami was, and how them being Quincy's fit into all of that. To say it was a long night for all involved would have been an understatement. When all was said and done, the entire family retired for the night, all unaware of the chain of events that was about to take place. Verena and Ichigo both could feel a knot appear in the back of the heads when at school the very next day the Shinigami, Rukia Kachiki, appeared in the class. They knew Kisuke was a genius at fixing things, but the girl had been injured the night before. Shouldn't she have been resting at the Shoten? Ichigo felt a tap on his shoulder and looked behind him at his annoying cousin. "A friend of yours?" Yuryu asked, sounding quite annoyed at him. Ichigo scoffed. "TCH," he leaned back in his seat. "I'll explain later, but try to ignore her." Sato eyed Ichigo. The two shared a look as Ichigo nodded towards Kigo and Mizuiro. An unspoken request was sent from one to the other to protect those two. Sato gave a nod before returning his gaze to the seemingly innocent-looking young woman before him. Over the years he'd begun to develop extrasensory abilities after meeting the Kurosaki twins. He could see spirits as well, and right now he could sense something from that girl, but he was unsure as to what it was. Verena watched Rukia walk towards her like nothing was going on and that it was the most normal thing in the world. To outside spectators, it was just that. To her, she was dreading the next hour of having to sit next to the Shinigami. Lunch couldn't come fast enough. Walking up the stairs to the roof, the twins walked next to each other with the Shinigami following them. When they got to the roof is when she began to talk. "Bringing me to an empty place. What dost thou intend to do to me?" Both turned and gave her a weird look. "Stop talking in that weird way," Ichigo exclaimed. "Weird?" She wondered, having recalled some of the books she'd read the night before. "How rude. Is it not good for someone who has learned in one day?" she asked. "Perhaps if we lived in the 15th or 16th centuries." Verena explained to her as she sat down upon the ground with her legs crossed in front of her. "If you're walking around, uninjured, why the hell haven't you returned to Soul Society?" Ichigo asked her as he leaned against the chain fence behind him. "Isn't your job over? Why are you even in my class of all places?" Verena shook her head as Ichigo's anger started to rise a bit, along with his voice. "Calm down, Ichi," she told him as she took a sip from her juice box. "You fool!" Rukia yelled back at him. "Only Shinigami can return to Soul Society. Right now, I'm unable to return there." She rubbed her arm and looked away from him with embarrassment crossing her face. "Huh?" he questioned, looking at her confusedly. "Because I've lost my Shinigami powers," she exclaimed angrily. "Huh? She has an angry streak too." Verena smiled. "Ichi may have met his match here." She continued to sip her drink. "Huh? How?" he asked as he scratched the back of his head. "When I was attacked by that hollow last night," she told him in a huff. "Something happened. I don't know how it stole my powers," she clenched her fist. "But I will get them back somehow," she sighed as she looked at him. "I have but barely any abilities left. I'm forced to be in this artificial body, she pointed at herself. A jigai, both twins said in unison. Rukia looked at them with surprise. Okay, now I must know, she began, what are you two and how do you exist? I know you stated you were a Shinigami/Quincy, she pointed at Verena. But that's impossible. Quincy's are enemies of Shinigami and vice versa. Verena chuckled. It's a bit of a story, she eyed the Shinigami woman. I have time. Rukia told her. The two stared at each other before Verena grinned. Okay, she said. Our father was a Shinigami named Isshin Shiba, captain of the 10th. She watched Rukia's eyes widen at the name of their father's name. He came to the world of the living because of reports of a powerful hollow in the area and decided to handle the situation himself. He found the hollow. Ichigo continued as he pulled the juice box out of Rukia's hands and opened it for her before handing it back. It was a possible Vastolord class, but he wasn't certain. It was fast and destructive. That was when a Quincy woman appeared. She saw this hollow overpowering the Shinigami and went to assist him. Verena said as she recalled the tale their mother had once told them. She would later become our mother. She destroyed the hollow. Ichigo told her with a small smile appearing on his face. She obliterated it, unfortunately, she got injured. Badly. Isshin, our father, had fallen in love with her after witnessing the strength this human woman possessed. Verena saw that Rukia was listening to every word they were saying. Beyond the doors to the roof she could sense their cousin listening to them. Yuryu was trying to hide his Ryatsu, but was unsuccessful when it came to her senses. The injury caused by the hollow had some of the hollow's Ryatsu within it and was beginning to hollowfy her. Unfortunately, Quincy's don't really hollowfy, they just die a very painful death. Ichigo explained. Pop didn't want to see this become her fate, he chuckled. That's when Getabushi appeared. Getabushi? Rukia wondered as she continued to drink her juice. Who is that? He helped Pop by sending him into Mom's inner world where he fought and sealed the hollow. Ichigo told her. Unfortunately, the only way to stop the hollowification was to bond Pop's soul to Mom's. Pop lost his powers, was placed into a jigai and then married Mom after she'd graduated high school. Verena told her. He went to college, became a doctor in order to support her and himself. Then they had us. Ichigo finished as he took a bite from the sandwich that Yuzu had packed for him. You're forgetting to mention me, King. Ichigo heard his hollow chuckle. Yeah, I know. He told the white-haired being. I've come to terms what you are, but something is telling me not to say anything about you. Oh. The white-haired hollow went silent for a moment. You think she'd try something? Ichigo stayed silent at that. Gotcha, King. I'll stay in the background. Where is Isshin Shiba today and why don't you go by his name? Rukia inquired but suddenly got a sense that had been the wrong thing to ask as both teens suddenly gave off a sad vibe. Our father was killed by the hollow called Grand Fisher after he had killed the monster and sacrificed himself to save our mother's life once again. Verena stated with some sadness to her voice. We use our mother's name because our father did have enemies who may try to harm us. Rukia's eyes had gotten wide at this revelation. Grand Fisher? He's a very powerful hollow. I know he has been on the list of deadly hollows for many years. Rukia bowed her head in respect. I'm sorry, she apologized at bringing up obviously painful memories. Another Shiba was killed by those monsters. She felt her own emotions try to come forward as the memory of her mentor's fate came to the forefront of her mind. Ichigo cleared his throat, regaining her attention. Getabushi trained us with Mom's permission, he told her. He's the one that gave you that body. We were going to check up on you after school, but since you're obviously alright, he went to walk towards the school doors. Wait! Rukia yelled out. I have a request for both of you, she bowed to the ground. I cannot continue my duties, so I plead with your honor. Please take over my duties and keep this town safe for me. Ichigo gave her a gentle push with his foot. We'd do that anyway, he grinned. So there's no need to ask when it's already a given. Thank you, she sighed as she was helped into a standing position by Ichigo a second later. Tag team? Verena asked as she stood up to follow them. Sensing Yuryu leaving, she supposed it was time to return to class. Sure. Ichigo agreed as he opened the door for the girls. I get the first week, you get the next, and so forth. Verena chuckled. Should we bring Yuryu and Chad with us? She asked with a grin. Yuryu will make it a competition, he grumbled as he followed them. Chad can't fight yet. Verena raised an eyebrow at him. Are you sure about that? She inquired with a tease in her voice. Ichigo blinked in surprise at her. Could Chad fight hollows now? He shook his head at the notion. How would that work? He stayed in his thoughts until he returned to class, where he soon was distracted by a new problem, math. Across town a black hole opened up, a garganta. Crawling out of the darkness, a multi-legged hollow began its prowl for its next meal and prey.